It's pure ideology.
Have you ever read something so stupid that it seems immune to serious criticism? Well, recently I came across this amazing article on our dear friend Shekhar Gupta's news website which fits that description perfectly. It's an opinion piece written by a guy called Jaytirath Rao from a couple of months ago, and the headline goes, "Dear Oxfam, stop looking for inequality in India, go back to distributing blankets." Now, let me quickly clarify what this article is not. It is not an attempt to provide any sort of coherent argument why Oxfam should stop looking for or talking about inequality in India. What the article is, though, is the hilarious ramblings of a confused 70-year-old uncle that is impossible to take seriously. So honestly, there isn't really a question of refuting what he has to say. Instead, we're just going to bask in its stupidity, marvel at the poisonous levels of ideology contained within, and, laugh at the silly old man yelling at the clouds. Low effort, I know, but hey, sometimes it's good to have some simple, clean fun. So, Mr. Rao, or Jerry as he's more popularly known, is apparently something of an IT industry veteran, and he begins his creed by bringing up a recent Oxfam report which suggested several ways to tackle the worsening wealth inequality in India. Then he goes into story mode. Some 25 years ago, I lived in London. I remember that at odd places on different streets, there would be Oxfam outlets where earnest individuals would collect old clothes for distribution among the poor. A worthy, dharmic and Christian act, if I may say so, even at the risk of offending the woke secular sensibilities of people at Oxfam. So straight off, you're in for a hell of a ride when in just the second paragraph, some ancient Uncle G is complaining about woke culture. Because I think it's a great early sign that we aren't really dealing with a very bright mind. But story time is over and Jerry is about to spit some uncomfortable truths. "Dear Oxfam," he writes, "I strongly recommend that you go back to your business of distributing old clothes to the poor. Stop issuing reports on economics, income, wealth and so on. This will only end up hurting the very desirable old clothes business. Additionally, I would also request you to stay away from making sweeping generalizations about India. Again, a subject which your staff seem to be massively ignorant about." So here's what I think happened. Jerry read a summary of this report, or perhaps just a headline, which, for lack of a better word, triggered him. And he looked at the name of the organization and remembered his time in London, and his old crumbling brain immediately thought, "Oh, those idiots who sit in a used clothes store in London are now writing these outrageous reports on the Indian economy. How dare they?" I can't prove this, of course, but the tone of the article throughout is, "Hey, dumb foreigners who sell old clothes, stay out of India's business and don't lecture us about what to do." Like when he writes a bit later, "You seem to be in the habit of providing homilies to Indians who you think don't know any better." I mean, dude, who are you talking to here? The authors? The report is written by Indian people. It lists out their names on page 2 of the document linked in your article. I don't know, perhaps he doesn't care who wrote the report as long as it's from an international NGO that's critical of India. The authors must all be paid foreign agents and liberal types spreading anti-India propaganda, which is actually a fairly common right-wing position and is basically the only form of Western imperialism they acknowledge and oppose. Not military imperialism or the imperialism of foreign capital, that they love, but NGO imperialism. And in their eyes, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, Oxfam and others of their ilk pose one of the gravest threats to Indian sovereignty. Once again, this tells us a lot about the level of intellect we're dealing with here. But if this report is indeed an act of NGO imperialism, it seems that the imperialists are getting kind of rusty and not doing their jobs very well.
They're not sending their best.
Because the contents of the report are actually quite tame. Like, the observations the authors make are fairly obvious and have been known for a while now, like the fact that greater and greater share of the national wealth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, that COVID-19 further worsened wealth inequality as the collective wealth of the richest 100 people in the country reached an all-time high at the same time as millions of Indians suffered from unemployment, loss of income, debt, hunger, ballooning healthcare costs and much worse, and that the differential impact of the pandemic on the rich and the poor, in their words, has been made possible systematically due to institutional structures that continue to perpetuate this inequality. Then they briefly go into a few of these structural issues, like our regressive taxation system, the insufficient public spending on health and education, and the increasing privatization of both these essential services. The measures the report suggests for tackling these issues are hardly radical, especially considering organizations organizations like the IMF and OECD have endorsed similar measures recently. They want the government to reintroduce a wealth tax and impose a temporary 1% surcharge on the wealthiest 10% of the population to fund public expenditure in health, education, social security, etc. That's it. Now, anyone can of course disagree with the report either factually or with the interpretation of the facts, and I've certainly not fact-checked the 5 pages worth of references at the end of the report. If a normal, sane person was looking to criticize the report, that's what they would have done, right? But if you're Jerry Rao, you are driven so mad by this frankly harmless report that a fact-based critique just won't do. Instead, Jerry, in his infinite dharmic wisdom, accuses Oxfam of inflicting spiritual terrorism by attempting to excite envy among us against our billionaire overlords. He writes, "Frankly, I don't care if my friends Bezos, Ambani, Adani, Zuckerberg see their wealth increase from 100 billion to 150 billion. Judeo-Christian teachings as well as the precepts of Sanatan Dharma tell me that I should not envy those who have been blessed by providence with greater wealth. I wonder why you, Oxfam, feel the need to excite and encourage the Iago within each of us. Is it because you and your staff are consumed by the green-eyed monster?" So here's a life lesson we need to take from a guy who has rigorously studied Sanatan Dharma, Judeo-Christian teachings and Shakespeare, that whenever someone criticizes you and you begin to wonder, why do people not seem to like me? Do they hate me because I'm an obnoxious rich asshole who is hoarding obscene amounts of wealth while millions of people suffer from hunger, disease and want? Actually, no, it can't be that. Me and my friends are blessed by providence. No, they hate me because they're jealous of how awesome and rich I am. And now they're also inciting the unwashed masses to envy me. God, I'm so spiritual. Moreover, Jerry is very worried that if we let Oxfam farm this envy, it is going to drag us back to the dark ages of Nehruvian socialism when envy was institutionalized and we were very, very rude to our top businessmen. He writes, "We were for decade after decade bruised, battered and wounded by high taxes and by a political dispensation that used envy as one of its principal levers. The Japanese state encouraged Zaibatsu like Mitsubishi and Hitachi. The Korean state supported chaebols like Samsung and Hyundai. The politicians of independent India ranted and railed against the Tatas and Birlas, just like you rail against Bezos, Ambani, Adani, Zuckerberg. From a position of being at the same level as Korea, we are now 80% poorer than them. This came from listening to the Oxfam lookalikes of earlier decades. Ignoring the patently stupid idea that envy is the reason India lagged behind other countries, I think it's hilarious when people like Jerry bitch and moan about how badly the Indian government treated its capitalist class and then in the same breath sing praises of the Korean government for supporting theirs, completely unaware of the massive coercive force the Korean government wielded to discipline their biggest capitalists. Indeed, Park Chung-hee, the general who came to power after a successful military coup in 1961 and who is considered to be the principal architect of the Korean economic miracle, did more than just rant and rail against the capitalists in his country. As soon as he came to power, Park locked up a number of prominent businessmen on the charge of accumulating wealth by illicit means and released them later in return for their promise to, quote, serve the nation through enterprise, that is, to do what the government and its economic planning body tells them to do. At the same time, Park nationalized the banks, thereby bringing the control of finance into the hands of the government, giving it enormous leverage over the capitalist class. Due to both these decisions, economist Ha Joon Chang writes, the business community suddenly became morally like criminals on parole and economically a paper tiger with little power to make investment decisions. If Nehru or Indira Gandhi had ever gone this far in disciplining the Indian capitalist class, people like Jerry would have spent decades denouncing them as the second coming of Joseph Stalin and written hundreds of op-eds demanding the execution of the entire Nehru-Gandhi family by a firing squad as punishment for the horrible sins of their ancestors. It isn't until we reach the final section of the article that Jerry, in my view, talks a little bit of sense, because he points out correctly that any radical attempt by the government to redistribute the wealth of billionaires through taxation will lead to tax evasion, endless litigation, and ultimately capital flight from the country. Of course, according to him, this is a foolproof argument against redistribution. Don't do anything to piss off the capitalists, otherwise they'll just pack up and leave, and things will be much worse than they are now. However, if one is not blinded by the dogma of neoliberal ideology and is actually concerned about the pitiful condition of India's working people, Jerry's point is actually a solid argument for curtailing the power of the capitalist class to essentially veto any policy decision that hurts their bottom line, even though it may improve the lives of hundreds of millions of people. As long as capital can move freely across national and international borders, capitalists have the ability to undermine redistribution, and no government, especially in a country like India, can afford to antagonize them too much, meaning that to even have redistribution on the agenda, they would need need to be a significant restructuring of the relationship between state and capital. Honestly, if someone forced me to write a strongly worded open letter to Oxfam, not that anyone will, but if they did, I'd probably say that the demand for redistribution rings a little hollow coming from an organization whose corporate benefactors, in their roles as leading members of the capitalist class, will do everything in their power to resist any restructuring of state-capital relations that would allow redistribution to happen. The authors are obviously aware of this, or at least half of this, when they write in their final recommendation that we must change the rules and shift the power in the economy and society. Like, yeah, agreed, 100% with you on that. Except that the people who pay all your salaries, they don't want to change the rules unless they favor them even more. And they'll definitely not allow all the power they've accumulated to just shift away from them. I don't know, it makes it kind of self-defeating and impotent, I guess. And I don't mean to shit on the authors. I assume they're perfectly sincere in their motivations, and I certainly don't have any moral high ground when it comes to sucking on the corporate teat. We all do it and benefit from it directly or indirectly. It just feels like something that truly shifts the status quo can't really come from organizations that are implicated in maintaining it. And like a broken clock that's right twice a day, Jerry's mind remarkably lands on a similar idea, though for quite different reasons, when he makes a few razor-sharp propositions in the article that I'd like to modify a bit. Proposition 1 goes, Oxfam needs poverty. If there were no poverty, there would be no need for Oxfam. I think I can agree with that proposition. It seems silly to have an organization like Oxfam if there is no poverty. But I'd also like to add a proposition 0 here to address the fact that Oxfam isn't responsible for creating poverty in the first place. That is our economic system. That is capitalism, which creates want in the midst of plenty and puts power in the hands of people that profit from that. That is what creates and sustains poverty. So that should be proposition 0. Jerry continues with his second proposition. Since Oxfam needs poverty, they have an incentive to perpetuate it. Now, of course, Jerry thinks it's a con job, that Oxfam staff is scheming and coming up with ways to deliberately keep India poor for their selfish reasons. I don't know, that could be the case, but I think that Jerry has kind of reached the correct conclusion, but based on faulty reasoning. I think that since Oxfam is crucially dependent on people who benefit from poverty, they don't have a strong enough incentive or capacity to reduce it through structural change. Then, building on the second one, Jerry's third proposition is that Oxfam is bound to produce reports and recommendations that will fulfill its goal, that is, perpetuate poverty. To which I'd say Oxfam is doomed to produce reports and recommendations that may provide decent academic discussions, but are largely ineffective. To these, I'll add my last and final proposition, which is that there is one section of society which benefits unequivocally from all of this, and that is the commentariat. For a right-wing intellectual and media personality like Jerry, this report is like his bread and butter. If it didn't exist, what would he get outraged at? What would inspire him to write stinking garbage like this? And then he gets to publish his hot takes on his friend's popular website, and he gets his clicks and ad revenue. And some people tell him he's done a great job giving it good to those NGO imperialists. Some people get pissed and write earnest rebuttals, and eventually some smug asshole makes fun of it on YouTube. I mean, everybody is happy. Oxfam has its report, Jerry got his article, I've got my video. We're all mining for content.
We're both part of the same hypocrisy.
I guess the only difference is that if you watch my videos, you're obviously a cooler person. And you know what? In this f***ed up world that's rapidly getting more I think we can call that a win.